She woke up barefoot on the porch with dirt on her hands, a gash on her arm, and no memory of who she was. A German shepherd stood guard beside her, growling at the neighbor who kept saying, "You've already signed the papers, Margaret." 10 strangers from 10 towns claim she changed their lives, but she can't remember a single one of their names. Every night, the same dream haunts her, a locked room, a child's voice, and a shovel buried in wet earth. She thought she was just losing her mind, until the dog led her straight to the man who wanted her memory erased. And the worst part? He was the one she trusted most. It all started with the sound of breathing that wasn't hers. It all started with the wind pressing through the screen door, slow and breathy like an old man trying to remember the words to a lullaby he hadn't sung in decades, and for a long moment, Margaret Lawrence didn't know whether she was dreaming, dying, or simply waking up from a life she could no longer name. She sat curled on the porch floorboards like a fallen doll, barefoot and stiff with cold, with her right hand clutched around something heavy, something metal and warm, but when she opened her palm, all she found was a tarnished house key and a smear of blood that didn't belong to her. Somewhere nearby, a German shepherd stood tall and silent, his coat gray at the muzzle, his eyes ancient with loyalty, and though she had no memory of him, no name to give him, he looked at her with the calm assurance of someone who had watched over her for a lifetime and had no plans to stop now. The road was still dark, cloaked in mist that clung to the hedges like ghosts too tired to finish their haunt, and beyond the silence of that morning, there were no cars, no voices, no music, only the sound of that dog's steady breathing, as if it were holding her in place with nothing but patience and presence. She stood slowly, the boards creaking beneath her like they remembered her weight, and every step toward the house felt like walking through wet wool, her limbs sluggish, her thoughts slower still, as if her very mind were wrapped in cotton and left out in the rain. Inside, the house was neat but unlived in, too clean, too quiet, with nothing on the counters and no light bulbs in the hallway fixtures, just the smell of lemon polish and a faint trace of lavender that somehow brought tears to her eyes before she even knew why. There was a letter on the kitchen table, written in a hand that looked oddly familiar, the letters slanted just enough to seem tired, and when she picked it up, it crackled like old bones and read in 4 words what no doctor ever had the courage to say aloud: "If you forget, follow Duke." She looked at the dog again, Duke, apparently, and he wagged his tail once, as if to say, "Finally, you're reading the script," before walking slowly toward the door, pausing only to glance back with an expression that felt more human than canine. There were no family photos in the house, no calendars, no clocks, no bills on the counter, not even dust on the shelves, just a kind of emptiness that didn't feel sad, but purposeful, like someone had tried to erase all the fingerprints of a life that had been deeply lived and deliberately forgotten. She wandered through the rooms one by one, pressing her fingers along the edges of furniture, waiting for some image to strike her like lightning, some scent or sound to reach down into her soul and pull out her name, but there was nothing, not even a hint of memory, just the sensation of having once loved something dearly and now being on the other side of a very long goodbye. That's when she heard the knock on the door, not loud, not hurried, but deliberate, and when she opened it, there stood a man in his 70s, holding a warm thermos and a gentle smile that seemed 2 parts kindness and 1 part pity. "Morning, Maggie," he said, as if they'd just spoken yesterday, and the name, Maggie, landed soft but strange in her chest, like a melody she'd almost forgotten but not quite. She didn't know how to answer, so she stepped back politely, letting him in, and he moved through the house with the comfort of someone who had walked these floors too many times to count, placing the thermos on the counter and looking her over with a tilt of his head that felt far more like inspection than affection. "You feeling better today?" he asked gently, as Duke lay down at her feet and watched the man's every move like a soldier guarding the last safe house on earth. She wanted to say yes, or maybe ask who he was, or even just pretend, but the words sat heavy in her throat, and all she could do was shake her head, confused, and hope that whatever came next would carry some piece of her back with it. He nodded slowly, as if expecting that, and said, "Well, maybe a walk will help bring the pieces back together. Sometimes memory needs motion, not medicine." And with that, he turned toward the door, motioning for her to follow, but Duke didn't move. In fact, he growled, low and barely audible, just enough to make the hair on her arms rise like a memory she didn't want to meet yet. The man looked down at the dog and chuckled softly, though there was no real humor in it, just something rehearsed and hollow. "Still don't trust me, huh, old boy," he muttered under his breath, and Maggie saw it, not a smile this time, but something else behind his eyes, something she couldn't quite name but that made her heart turn cold in her chest. She looked at Duke, who now stood and faced the man full on, eyes locked like he was waiting for a mistake. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice thin and foreign in her own mouth. And with a pause just long enough to notice, the man turned back to her with that same soft smile and said, "Don't worry, Maggie. It's just a little place, where they still remember who you used to be." "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "To someone who remembers you better than you remember yourself," the man said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they stepped down from the porch, and the morning mist seemed to fold around them like the pages of a book that had been waiting too long to be opened, its stories quiet but restless, as if memory itself were watching from the tree branches and window panes. Duke trotted ahead but not far, his head turning every few steps to make sure Maggie followed, his every movement deliberate, his tail a steady pendulum that seemed to count down the seconds between now and something she didn't yet understand but could feel building just beneath her ribs. The man, whose name still hadn't been offered, moved with the confidence of someone who knew every crack in the sidewalk, every chipped paint corner of every fence they passed, and though he said nothing for a long stretch of road, his silence felt intentional, like he was waiting to see what she would remember without his help. Maggie glanced at the houses, the gardens, the faded mailboxes with names she didn't recognize, but each front door stared back at her blankly, offering no hint of recognition, no warmth, just the vague hum of a place that used to be familiar but had long since shifted its shape in her absence. It wasn't until they rounded the corner and came upon the rusted gate of a small railway station that something inside her stirred, not a memory, exactly, but the outline of one, like seeing the shape of a bird in flight without knowing its name. The platform was empty, the wooden benches aged and splintered, but there on the far end, sitting beneath a crooked awning in a chair that looked older than the building itself, was a man wearing a red scarf around his neck and tapping his cane in rhythm to a song no one else could hear. He looked up the moment Duke stepped forward, and the smile that bloomed across his face wasn't casual or polite, it was the kind of smile people reserve for miracles, the kind that carries years of waiting and a flicker of hope they dared not speak aloud. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly, rising with effort but without hesitation. She finally found her way back home. Maggie blinked, her heart thudding in her ears, and she opened her mouth to ask who he was, but he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges and held together with a piece of Scotch tape like it had been read and reread too many times. "This," he said, unfolding it with trembling hands, "was the day I lost everything, except for the one woman who stopped me from ending it all." She stepped forward, staring at the photo, an image of a younger man holding a guitar in front of a train car, his eyes hollow, his posture broken, and there in the corner of the picture was a figure she could barely make out, someone holding his shoulder. "That was you," he said, voice cracking not from age but from gratitude too big for words. "You saw me sitting here that day, Maggie. You brought me coffee, listened to me talk about how music didn't matter anymore, how no one would care if I just disappeared between the rails." She didn't know what to say, because she didn't remember it, but something inside her, something warm and aching, responded as though her bones had heard a tune they'd once known by heart. "You told me one song could save a man's life," he went on, tapping his cane again, "and you sat right there, right where you're standing now, and you made me sing like it was the last train out of this world." The man's voice softened as he said it, and a tear slid down one weathered cheek, catching on the edge of his scarf like a secret unwilling to fall. "I play here every Thursday now," he whispered, "even if no one listens, just in case you ever came back." Maggie took the clipping, her hands trembling slightly, and for a second, only a second, she felt something flash behind her eyes, a vision of a train whistle, the cold iron bench beneath her, and the way her own voice sounded when she whispered, "One song. That's all it takes." It was gone just as quickly, but her knees felt weak, and Duke moved close to her side, pressing his head gently against her hip, anchoring her like a lighthouse in a storm she couldn't yet name. The man with the red scarf took her hand and held it like something sacred, and though she still didn't know his name, she didn't pull away. Behind her, the other man, still silent, still watching, cleared his throat and said, "Well now, that's one place. One piece. Maybe enough for today." But the man in the red scarf looked past him, his expression shifting, his smile fading slightly as he glanced down at Duke. "You're not the one bringing her back, are you?" he asked slowly, the joy in his voice suddenly tempered by something sharper, something wary. "No," Maggie answered before she could think. "Duke is." There was a pause, not long, but deep enough to shift the air. And then, from the edge of the bench, she asked quietly. "Why don't I remember helping you?" she asked softly, more to herself than to the man in the red scarf. "Because the things we do for others tend to leave deeper roots in them than they ever do in us," he said. His answer drifted through the stillness like a hymn half-remembered, and though it didn't solve the riddle growing in her chest, it planted something, small, gentle, but firm, like the tip of a green shoot pressing up through dry earth, ready to find the light again. As Maggie turned away from the platform, Duke rose beside her, his steps slow but purposeful, and the man who had brought her there, still nameless, still smiling too easily, trailed behind without a word, as if he knew the next stop on this strange pilgrimage was not his to announce, only to follow. The sky had begun to warm now, lifting the mist inch by inch off the rooftops and fences, revealing more of the world with every step, but still, Maggie recognized nothing, not the street names, not the houses, not the faces peeking from behind curtains like memories afraid to be seen too soon. They walked for nearly half an hour through the winding back roads of a neighborhood that seemed content to keep its secrets tucked behind peeling fences and weathered mailboxes, until Duke stopped without warning at the edge of a vacant lot, where wildflowers spilled across the grass in defiance of the broken fence that tried to contain them. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing more than an abandoned patch of land, overgrown and long forgotten, but Maggie felt something shift inside her chest the moment her feet touched the ground, as if the earth itself had been waiting to recognize her footsteps again. The man behind her raised an eyebrow and said nothing, but Duke moved forward with purpose, nudging open a wooden gate that swung without a sound, revealing a narrow stone path covered in moss and scattered petals that glowed faintly in the early light like pieces of a long-lost mosaic. There, at the center of the lot, stood a garden, not manicured or symmetrical, but beautiful in a way that only something grown by many hands can be, every plant bending in different directions like people gathered in quiet conversation, blooming without needing permission. At the far end, beside a rusted watering can and a faded wind chime that danced lazily in the breeze, sat a wooden bench carved with initials Maggie didn't remember carving but somehow knew had once been hers. Before she could speak, a voice called out from behind a low arch of roses, warm and cracked with age but carrying a joy that made the garden itself seem to lean in and listen. "Maggie Lawrence, is that really you? Or has the garden finally gone and made me start seeing ghosts?" From between the blooms emerged a woman in her late 70s, her hands dirt-stained and calloused, with a straw hat tilted far back on her head and a pair of gardening shears tucked into the pocket of her apron like they belonged there more than anywhere else on earth. Maggie opened her mouth, trying to match the face to the voice, but nothing came, just a slow ache in her chest that felt too tender to touch, like a photograph you don't remember taking but know belongs to you. The woman walked toward her and took her hands without hesitation, laughing through tears that came too quickly to hide. "You started this place, don't you remember? Right after your husband passed. You said the world needed one more kind thing, and you weren't about to wait for someone else to make it." She gestured to the beds of lavender and tomatoes, to the row of handmade signs where names had been etched in childlike lettering, each one bearing the name of a different child from the neighborhood, now grown and scattered like dandelion seeds on the wind. "You taught them how to plant with their hands and heal with their hearts, Maggie. You gave them this space when they had nowhere else to go." Still, Maggie said nothing, not because she didn't believe it, but because the weight of it was too much to carry all at once. The woman continued, her voice softening. "I remember the day you brought in that boy, Eli, the one who never spoke above a whisper. You gave him that corner patch and said, 'Grow something you can't name.' And when that rose bloomed blood red, he said his first word in 3 years, alive. A tear slid down Maggie's cheek, not from sorrow, but from a kind of awe she didn't know how to contain. The woman guided her to the bench and sat beside her, brushing dirt from Maggie's palm with the familiarity of someone who'd done it 100 times before. "You always said flowers remember what people forget," she whispered, eyes scanning the garden. "Looks like they've been waiting for you to come back." Maggie looked out at the blooms, the way the morning sunlight made them shimmer with quiet pride, and for a moment, just a moment, she remembered the feeling of planting something in broken soil and watching it come alive. But that peace didn't last long, because from the edge of the garden, the man who'd brought her there cleared his throat again, louder this time, and said, "Well now, that's 2 places. But if we stay too long, we'll miss the next stop." The woman in the straw hat turned to him, her eyes narrowing just slightly, and said, "She doesn't need to be rushed. Healing doesn't care about schedules." Duke barked once, short, sharp, almost like a warning, and Maggie noticed, for the first time, how the man's jaw tensed ever so slightly when he heard it. She stood up slowly, brushing off her skirt, and turned to the woman. "What was my husband like?" Maggie asked softly, as though the very sound of the question might shatter something fragile inside her. "He was the kind of man who left music behind him wherever he went, even in the silence," the woman answered, her voice thick with memory. The garden seemed to pause at those words, the breeze slowing just enough to carry the scent of blooming lavender across their shoulders like a shawl woven from a different time, one where voices hadn't yet broken, and promises still echoed long after they'd been whispered. "He wasn't loud, no," the woman continued, her fingers absently tracing the handle of her shears as if tuning a memory like a delicate string. "But when he spoke, it was as if the words had already been practiced in his heart 100 times before." Maggie listened without interrupting, feeling the pull of something just beyond reach, a weight in her chest that pressed not painfully, but patiently, like a story asking to be told in its own time. "You and Henry," the woman said with a wistful smile, "you danced even when there was no music, and laughed even when life gave you reasons not to." She nodded toward the far end of the garden where an old weather-worn gazebo stood, wrapped in ivy and thyme. "Right there," she said gently, "under those vines, you renewed your vows on your 30th anniversary. He played that little song he wrote just for you, what was it called?" Maggie didn't answer. She didn't know. But something, maybe the rhythm of the words, maybe the smell of lilacs near the fence, triggered the ghost of a tune in her mind, just a whisper of melody, as if someone had once hummed it in the dark beside her while she drifted into sleep. Duke barked again, softer this time, and turned his gaze toward the path beyond the gate, as if inviting them onward, not with urgency, but with reverence. The woman rose and gave Maggie's hand one last squeeze, pressing something into her palm before letting go. It was a tiny slip of paper, no bigger than a church bulletin, and written in a man's hand were the words, "The piano remembers what the mind forgets." Maggie folded the paper slowly, as though afraid it might dissolve in her fingers, and tucked it into her pocket with care. The man who had brought her, still hovering near the gate, cleared his throat yet again, louder this time, with a tension in his posture that no longer seemed like mere restlessness. "Plenty more places to go," he said, smiling thinly. "If you want your memory back, we can't spend all day talking about flowers and fairy tales." Maggie turned toward him, but before she could answer, Duke had already begun walking. They followed the old shepherd through quieter streets this time, the kind that sat on the edge of town where memories tend to gather like dust in forgotten corners, and soon they reached a small white chapel, tucked behind trees heavy with spring bloom and secrets. The sign was old, hand-painted, its black lettering faded from the sun, but still legible enough to make her heart stutter, First Grace Baptist, service Thursdays, music every day. Inside, the chapel was empty, pews worn with use but polished with care, the kind of place where grief and joy had sat side by side for decades, neither overstaying their welcome. There, at the piano, sat a man with silver hair and dark hands that moved like water over the keys, playing something slow, something aching, something that wasn't written on any sheet but lived deep in the wood of the instrument itself. He didn't look up when they entered, just kept playing, note after note, like pulling thread through the fabric of time, and Maggie stood there frozen, because she knew that song, even if her mouth couldn't form the words. The melody wrapped around her like an old blanket, the kind passed down from mother to daughter, smelling faintly of cedar and safety and nights spent waiting by the fire for someone who never came. When the music stopped, the man finally turned, and for a long moment, he just looked at her. "I played that at your husband's funeral," he said gently, his voice deep and sure, like a hymn remembered by heart. "You asked me to, because you said it was the last thing he ever wrote." Maggie reached out to steady herself on the back of the pew, her breath caught between disbelief and something heavier, something resembling guilt. "You stood right there," he said, pointing to the aisle, "and when I finished, you whispered to him, even though he was already gone, 'I'll remember you in every note.'" She didn't remember that, not fully, but the words pierced something inside her, like light breaking through shutters that had been nailed closed for too long. The pianist rose slowly, walking toward her with careful steps, then placed his hand on her shoulder. "Do you still hear it?" he asked softly. "Even now?" She nodded once, not with certainty, but with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could. In the quiet that followed, the man at the door shifted again, checking his watch this time, an oddly modern gesture in a place untouched by time. Duke growled low, so low it could have been mistaken for a groan, but Maggie heard the difference, and it sent a chill down her spine. The pianist stepped back, sensing the change, and looked toward the door, his eyes narrowing not with suspicion, but something closer to warning. "You'll want to be careful who walks beside you," he said under his breath, just loud enough for Maggie to hear. "Not every guide leads you home." Maggie didn't respond, not yet, but as Duke moved toward the chapel doors again, she followed without looking back. Just outside, she paused beneath the blooming dogwood trees and whispered, almost to herself. "What else have I forgotten that I promised to remember?" Maggie asked, her voice barely louder than the breath of wind in the trees. "Something written in your own hand," the man said behind her, too quickly, as if he'd been waiting for that question longer than she had. They were walking again before she knew it, Duke slightly ahead, never out of sight, moving with the patience of someone guiding a loved one through a house where every creak of the floorboards held a memory too sacred to disturb. The air had changed now, warmer and more fragrant, thick with the scent of magnolia and old leaves, and though she didn't recognize the winding streets or the wooden signs nailed to telephone poles, something in her bones felt the tug of familiarity, like a song she'd hummed once while folding laundry on a quiet Sunday afternoon. They came to a small, sloped-roof house nestled between two aging maple trees, the kind of place where wind chimes played lullabies and the screen door never latched quite right, and the moment Maggie stepped onto the porch, she felt something inside her tighten, not with fear, but with a kind of reverence, like stepping into a church no one had prayed in for years. The woman who opened the door looked surprised at first, but not frightened. In fact, she smiled so quickly, so fully, that Maggie felt like the two of them had already shared something too deep to explain, something that didn't need names or memories to validate. "I knew you'd come," the woman said, holding the door open wide, as if Maggie belonged to the house more than she ever had. "The attic's just the same, untouched, just the way you left it." Maggie blinked at her, trying to place the face or the voice, but there was no spark of recognition, just the steady pull of something waiting, something unfinished. The woman didn't seem to mind her silence. She led them through the narrow hallway with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every squeaky floorboard and faded photo frame, until they reached a set of wooden stairs that creaked in all the right places. Duke stayed at the bottom, his eyes following them upward as if reluctant to leave the ground, and Maggie hesitated for a moment on the first step, suddenly unsure if she was climbing toward the past or away from it. The attic was lit by a single bulb that buzzed softly overhead, casting long shadows on the boxes stacked like sentries guarding old secrets, and there, in the center of the room, was a small chest, blue, chipped at the corners, and held shut by nothing more than an old belt looped through its handles. Maggie knelt slowly, her hands trembling as they reached for the belt, and as soon as she opened the lid, the smell of cedar and dust greeted her like a whisper from someone she used to love. Inside were dozens of letters, some sealed, some folded loosely, some stained with what looked like tears, and all written in the same careful handwriting, hers. The woman knelt beside her and picked one up, unfolding it with care. "You wrote these for the soldiers," she said gently. "Every week, without fail. Most of them never wrote back. But one did." She handed Maggie a letter, this one different, faded, frayed at the edges, but sealed with wax that had cracked like old skin. Maggie opened it slowly, and as her eyes scanned the page, she didn't need to read more than a few lines to know that it wasn't just any soldier, it was the one who had come home and waited for her on the train platform for nearly a year, even after she'd stopped writing. His name was Samuel. He had signed the letter with the words, "You gave me a reason to come home. I just hope I was the one you were waiting for." Maggie's breath caught, and in that moment, an image flared in her mind, of a younger version of herself at a desk, candle flickering, pen scratching against paper while tears streamed down her cheeks for reasons she no longer remembered. "You met him once," the woman whispered, her voice low, "in this house. He brought flowers. You were already with Henry by then. But he thanked you anyway, and said goodbye." A silence followed, not empty but full of what-ifs, full of kindness, full of love that had never asked for anything in return. Downstairs, the man who had brought her stood leaning against the banister, arms folded, his expression unreadable, though Duke still watched him with the unwavering focus of a soldier who knows where danger sleeps. Maggie tucked the letter into her pocket with the others, and slowly rose to her feet, feeling as if she were carrying something heavier than paper but lighter than grief. The woman followed her to the door and paused before opening it, her eyes soft and steady. "There was a second letter," she said quietly. "One you wrote, but never sent. Would you like to read it?" Maggie looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. The woman reached behind a bookshelf and pulled out a small envelope, brittle and unsealed, addressed in her own hand, but not to a soldier. This one was marked simply, "To the one who betrayed me." Maggie's heart skipped. Her breath stilled. But before she could open it, the man's voice called up the stairs. "Time to keep moving, Maggie," he said, "too fast. You've seen enough for one day." And that's when Maggie turned, envelope still in her hand, and asked the woman beside her. "Why would I write a letter to someone I hadn't remembered hating?" Maggie asked, the envelope still trembling gently in her hand. "Because some betrayals don't come with lightning or thunder," the woman said softly. "They come with silence, trust, and too many second chances." The answer settled into the room like dust in late afternoon sun, quiet, weightless, but impossible to ignore, clinging to every edge of thought, wrapping itself around the corners of Maggie's mind like something that had always been there, just waiting for the light to catch it again. She didn't open the letter. Not yet. She folded it gently, almost respectfully, as if whatever words were inside had been written by a version of herself that she wasn't ready to meet. Then she tucked it into her coat pocket beside the others, close to her heart, where things worth remembering tend to live longest. The woman walked her back to the door, her eyes softer now, tinged with a kind of sadness that didn't beg for explanation. It was the kind of sadness you carry quietly, the kind that never leaves but learns to live beside you, like a shadow on a sunny day. Outside, the man stood waiting, hands in his coat pockets, his expression just warm enough to pass for friendly, though not so warm as to be sincere, and for the first time, Maggie noticed how his smile never reached his eyes, not even halfway. Duke was sitting by the front steps, ears alert, tail still, watching the man the way a storm watches a match being lit, patient, quiet, ready. "We're running out of daylight," the man said, too quickly, glancing toward the street as though time itself were chasing him. "Next place isn't far." Maggie didn't speak. She simply nodded and followed Duke down the walkway, each step slower than the last, not because she was tired, but because the air around her had started to feel thicker, like the weight of unspoken things was finally beginning to rise. They walked through the edge of town now, where the houses grew farther apart and the trees leaned in closer, as if to listen more carefully to the footsteps passing beneath them. Duke led them to a small white cottage with a screened-in porch and a mailbox painted with faded sunflowers. The porch swing creaked as they approached, and the front door opened before they could knock. An elderly woman stepped out, wearing a cardigan too big for her shoulders and slippers that had seen better years, but her eyes, those soft, silver eyes, held the strength of someone who had waded through more winters than she cared to count. "Maggie," she breathed, her voice full of reverence, "I was starting to think I dreamed you." Maggie didn't recognize her face, but when the woman stepped aside and led them into the front room, her eyes were drawn instantly to what hung across the back wall, a quilt, large and vivid, stitched together from dozens of pieces of fabric, each square bearing a name in neat, careful thread. It was a memory wall made of cloth, and it pulled at Maggie's chest like a song made of breath and thread and years. "You don't remember making it, do you?" the woman asked gently, already knowing the answer. "It was your idea, after the flood." The word hit her like a bell, flood, but no images came. Only a sound, muffled and rushing, somewhere just behind her ears, and the cold feeling of standing in water that didn't care who it took. "You helped every one of us," the woman said, brushing her fingers over a name stitched in burgundy thread. "You gave away every blanket in your house, then took scraps from neighbors and sewed through the night by candlelight." Maggie reached out, her fingers grazing a patch of flannel that made her breath hitch. A child's shirt. She didn't remember whose, but her hand did. It remembered the shape, the softness, the moment it was folded and sewn with quiet care into the square. The woman brought her a cup of tea, fragrant and warm, and they sat together in silence for a moment, staring at the quilt like it was the only map they still trusted. Then the woman leaned in, her voice low and steady. "You also promised us something that night," she said. "You promised if the storm ever came again, not rain, but a different kind, you'd come back and help us remember who we are." Maggie turned to her, startled. "What kind of storm?" she asked, and the woman's gaze shifted, just slightly, toward the man leaning against the doorframe. "One that doesn't come from the sky," she whispered. "One that walks on two legs and smiles while it erases things." Before Maggie could respond, Duke stood abruptly, body rigid, tail raised, not aggressive, but alert. The kind of stillness that comes just before something breaks. The man at the door straightened, too, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, his smile flickering for just a second as his eyes darted toward the street. "Well, this has been lovely," he said briskly. "But we really must be going." Maggie rose, but not before placing her hand on the quilt one more time. "You stitched your own name last," the woman said quietly. "Bottom right corner. You said it was a promise." Maggie looked, and there it was, Margaret Eldon, stitched in faded green, just above a square of blue gingham. She swallowed hard, and turned toward the door, where the man already stood waiting. As Duke moved to her side again, she paused on the porch and asked the woman one last question, her voice barely above the breeze. "Who was I making all these promises to?" Maggie asked, her fingers still resting on the stitched corner of the quilt that bore her name. "To the ones nobody else believed would ever matter," the woman said softly. "Especially to the one behind the shed." The name meant nothing to Maggie at first, just a phrase that hung in the air like an old riddle whispered too late at night, but Duke turned his head sharply at the words, ears raised, eyes focused, and for a long moment, even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. They walked again, not far this time, just a few blocks beyond the last porch light, where the sidewalks crumbled into gravel and the street signs leaned like old men too tired to stand straight. The houses here weren't unkind, but they were tired, windows fogged, mailboxes dented, yards left half-mowed as if the energy to finish had simply run out one afternoon and never returned. Duke led them to the end of the street, where a narrow lane veered off behind a cluster of tool sheds and battered pickup trucks, and Maggie followed without asking, though the ache in her knees reminded her that not every memory was kind to carry. At the back of one lot, barely visible through the trees, sat a sagging structure that could barely be called a house, a one-room shack, held up by stubbornness and rusted nails, its roof patched with tin, its door barely hanging on the hinges. A man stood beside it, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair shaved close and a long, jagged scar tracing from his left eyebrow to the corner of his cheek, the kind of scar people pretend not to notice but never forget once they've seen. He was stacking wood by hand, slowly and methodically, and when he turned and saw her, he froze, not in fear or surprise, but in reverence, like seeing someone rise from a photograph too long kept in a wallet. "Maggie Lawrence," he said, not with a question, but a certainty born of decades. "You came back." His voice was gravel comfort, rough but honest, and he walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, the kind of steps men take when approaching something holy. She didn't know him. Not yet. But something in her chest cracked wide at the sound of his voice, like an old door swinging open that had been sealed by time and sorrow. "You don't remember me," he said softly, "but I remember everything." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a photo, faded and folded too many times to count. He handed it to her gently. It showed a small boy, maybe 7, maybe 8, with wild hair and eyes far too old for his age, sitting cross-legged on a patch of dirt behind what looked like the very same shed. And there she was, kneeling beside him, arm wrapped around his narrow shoulders, her smile tired but unwavering, as if she'd been fighting a storm with nothing but kindness and grit. "They said I was broken," he whispered. "Said I wasn't right in the head, that I'd never speak, never trust, never belong." Maggie stared at the image, heart pounding as something flickered behind her eyes, a memory, maybe, or just the ghost of a cold evening, a rusty metal bucket, and a child shaking so hard she wrapped him in her own coat without asking anyone's permission. "You found me sleeping out here in the snow," he said, eyes wet now but steady. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You didn't call anyone. You just sat down beside me and told me stories that made me believe people could be better than what I'd seen." She felt her knees buckle slightly, and Duke moved close, steadying her like the guardian he had always been. "I said my first word that night," the man continued, voice trembling. "Not to a doctor. Not to a teacher. To you. I said, stay. Because I didn't want you to go." Maggie covered her mouth, a sob rising without permission, the kind that doesn't ask whether a memory is real or imagined, it just knows. "I became a counselor," he said quietly. "Work with foster kids now. Ones like me. Ones like I was. And every time I sit across from one of them and say, 'You matter,' I hear your voice behind mine." The man stepped forward, placing the photo back in her hand like a sacred offering, and for the first time that day, she felt the weight of the past not as a burden, but as something holy. From the shadows, the man who had brought her so far cleared his throat again, this time not out of impatience, but something closer to nervousness, a flicker of discomfort that passed quickly, but not quickly enough. "You've done good work," he said, forcing a smile, "but she's got more places to be." The younger man turned, his eyes hardening just enough to make the air tighten between them. "Funny," he said. "She always knew where she needed to go, never needed anyone to decide for her." Maggie looked between them now, something unspoken beginning to stir in her chest, not quite recognition, not yet truth, but the shadow of both. She turned to the man who had given her that photo and asked, her voice steady and sure. "What else have I said that I've forgotten?" Maggie asked, holding the worn photo like it was the last piece of herself still breathing. "You said your memory didn't matter as long as your promises outlived your name," the man answered, his voice steady as a hymn. The weight of his words didn't fall all at once, it moved slowly, like dusk creeping over an old porch, touching everything it passed with quiet finality, and Maggie stood there in the silence, feeling their truth echo inside her chest like the closing of a church door after prayer. She turned to Duke, whose eyes never left hers, and though the dog had said nothing in all their wandering, his presence had spoken louder than 100 voices could, steadying her with every step, reminding her, without words, that something unbroken still lived beneath the confusion. They walked again, now toward the outskirts of town, where houses gave way to open fields and the wind smelled of dry earth and old leaves, and Maggie could feel it, that shift in the air that always comes before something buried decides to rise. The road curved into gravel, and gravel turned to dirt, until they reached a narrow driveway overgrown with weeds and framed by a crooked wooden archway that bore no sign, only the faded ghost of one. It was a property that might have once been a home, though now it looked more like a forgotten promise, with paint peeling from the siding and a chimney tilting just slightly to the left, like a man who'd taken one too many blows and still stood anyway. Duke stopped first, planting his paws in the dust and staring at the door with a tension Maggie hadn't felt in him before, not fear exactly, but readiness, as if whatever they'd been circling was finally close enough to touch. The man walked ahead this time, reaching into his coat pocket and producing a brass key with a ribbon tied around it, blue, frayed, familiar, and without a word, he opened the door and stepped inside, as if he belonged there. Maggie followed slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and as she crossed the threshold, she felt it again, that strange sensation she'd had on the porch so many days ago, like the walls remembered her even if her mind did not. The inside was empty of furniture but full of traces, a crooked frame on the wall where a photo had once hung, a hook by the door where a coat had rested, a faint outline of bookshelves long since removed. But it wasn't the silence that caught her attention, it was the floorboard beneath her left foot, the one that gave a soft, hollow creak unlike the others, as if it had something left to say. Without being asked, the man knelt and pried up the edge of the board with his pocketknife, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the floor, small, dark, just wide enough to hold a single envelope. He pulled it out, handed it to her gently, and stepped back. Maggie turned it over. There was no name on the outside, no address, no stamp. Just a piece of folded parchment wrapped in a red thread that looked older than she felt. She opened it slowly, and inside was a deed, an official document, stamped and signed, showing that this property, this land, this house, belonged to her. The date on the paper made her knees tremble, 10 years ago. The signature was hers. And beneath it, in handwriting she barely recognized as her own, were the words, to be used as a sanctuary for the forgotten, human and animal alike. To remain forever in trust. She stared at it, stunned, her breath short, her heart pounding with questions that came too quickly to shape. "I don't remember buying this," she whispered. The man smiled, but it was thinner this time, closer to nervousness than pride. "You didn't tell anyone," he said quietly. "You just did it. Said people didn't need to understand kindness. They only needed to feel it." Duke barked once, sharp, deliberate, almost like punctuation, and Maggie turned to him, suddenly aware that his gaze had shifted not toward her, but back toward the man. "You knew about this all along," she said, her voice narrowing slightly. The man nodded slowly, but he didn't speak. Not at first. Then he said something that didn't land the way it should have. "You almost forgot it existed," he muttered. "Would have been such a waste, all that land just sitting here." Something about the way he said it made her step back, just half a step, barely noticeable, but Duke noticed, and he growled low in his throat, the kind of growl that makes air feel colder. "I had to keep it safe," the man added quickly, too quickly now. "After you started getting confused, someone had to look after it. Handle the paperwork. You said I could." Maggie blinked, the world tilting, not from dizziness but realization, small, slow, insistent, like a splinter pressing beneath skin too long ignored. "I said that?" she asked, her voice hushed. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward her, 1 foot closer than she was ready for, and said, "You don't have to worry about all this now, Maggie. Let's go. You've remembered enough." And for the first time, Maggie didn't follow. She turned to Duke, who stood between them now, silent, unmoving, his eyes locked on the man with a certainty that needed no words. Maggie tightened her grip on the deed, and though her voice shook, she asked, "Why do you keep acting like I was never supposed to find this place?" Maggie asked, her voice quiet but trembling with something dangerous and new. "Because forgetting is easier than remembering what this land was really meant to protect," the man said, and for the first time, his smile vanished completely. The silence that followed didn't feel like the gentle hush of twilight or the peaceful stillness between two old friends, it felt more like the kind of silence that settles into a courtroom just before a verdict is read, heavy, breathless, and impossible to ignore. Duke's growl deepened, low and constant now, like a motor warming beneath a cold hood, his body positioned directly between them, as if he could sense something Maggie was only now beginning to understand. She looked down at the deed again, fingers brushing the ink that bore her own name, and for the first time in days, a sharp edge of memory pierced through the fog, just a flash, a moment, but real. A warm kitchen. A younger version of herself. Her hand resting on this very piece of paper. And a voice, his voice, soft, persuasive, saying, "Don't worry about the legal parts, Maggie. Let me take care of it for you." Her knees buckled slightly under the weight of that image, and she reached for the doorway, gripping the frame as if the wood itself could hold her steady. "You said you were helping me," she whispered, barely able to speak around the lump in her throat. "You said I could trust you." The man didn't answer. He simply looked at her, not cruelly, not kindly, but the way a man looks at something that was supposed to stay buried. "I gave you everything," she said, louder now, her voice shaking with anger more than confusion. "I gave you my power of attorney. I let you into my house, my life, because I thought you were family." "You were slipping," he said finally, no longer trying to sound gentle. "And somebody had to make decisions before things got messy." "But they weren't your decisions to make," she shot back, the words leaving her mouth before she'd even thought them through. He stepped forward once, too close, too sudden, and Duke barked, sharp and immediate, lunging with enough force to send the man stumbling back toward the edge of the porch, his hands raised, face pale. "I didn't take anything that wasn't already halfway mine," he snapped, the mask cracking at last. "You're alone. You have no one. You were leaving everything to some dog sanctuary and a bunch of sad stories." Maggie's hands clenched, not in fear but in a kind of sorrow that no longer asked permission. "That's the point," she said, her voice steady now. "Those sad stories. They were people. Kids. Souls. And I remember them now." The man laughed bitterly, rubbing his wrist where Duke's teeth had grazed the skin. "No one's gonna believe some half-scattered old woman who spent the last year asking where she put her keys," he muttered. "You were losing time, Maggie. Slipping. You didn't even remember your husband's name 2 months ago." She stepped forward then, slow, strong, unshaken, and looked him in the eye. "Well, I remember it now," she said, her voice like steel under velvet. "Henry. His name was Henry. And he warned me once," said a man who calls himself your friend but counts your money too often is no friend at all. The words stopped him like a blow. His face went blank. And just then, from behind the house, a second car pulled up, a dusty old sedan with a dented bumper and a license plate that hadn't been changed in years. The door opened, and out stepped the woman from the attic, the one who had given her the letter addressed, "To the one who betrayed me." She was holding a small folder in her hands. "I think she's ready to read this now," the woman said, her voice loud enough for both of them to hear. "And I think the county clerk might be interested too." The man's face blanched. Maggie took the folder, opened it slowly, and inside were documents, bank transfers, property applications, signatures that weren't hers but looked enough like hers to pass. Duke let out one low, satisfied huff. And Maggie turned to him, the man who had called himself her helper, her neighbor, her friend, and said, "You almost erased me." Then she turned back to the woman and asked, her voice calm, her breath steady. "How long have you known what he was doing?" Maggie asked, her voice low but sharpened by something no longer clouded by confusion. "Long enough to know you needed to remember on your own, before anyone else told you what your story was," the woman answered, without a hint of apology in her voice. She stepped forward, her worn shoes crunching softly over the gravel as she handed Maggie the final document, the one with the date, the forged signature, and the name of the shell company quietly registered in the man's name 3 towns over. The man had gone quiet now, his hands no longer confident in his pockets, his eyes no longer steady but restless, darting toward the road like a fox caught in daylight. For the first time, he seemed to understand that silence, Maggie's silence, the town's silence, the silence of a dog who never barked without purpose, had never been ignorance. It had been patience. Watching. Waiting. Maggie didn't speak for a long while. She stood there on the threshold of the house she had once saved from foreclosure with a quiet act of faith. Her mind had been taken from her, piece by piece, over months, days blurred, names misplaced, conversations lost like feathers in the wind, but standing here now, she felt something return. Not all at once. Not with fanfare. But like the turning of a tide that had obeyed the moon long enough. She looked down at Duke, who sat beside her now like a statue carved from loyalty and time, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on her like he had known all along what she was finally strong enough to see. "You let me believe I was just old," she said softly, not to accuse, but to name what had nearly broken her. "You let me believe I couldn't trust my own mind." The man didn't answer. His silence had finally run out of places to hide. Maggie looked at the woman beside her, then back at the house, then down at the folder full of signatures and shadows and stolen things, and she smiled, not with bitterness, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been underestimated one too many times. "I want the town to know what this place was for," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, like wind filling the sails of something long docked. "Not just the dogs. Not just the children. But the forgotten. The silenced. The people someone else wrote off and pushed aside." The woman nodded once, and behind her, a car began to pull into the driveway, an old county vehicle, official seal on the door, and in the passenger seat, the man from the chapel who had played her husband's melody without ever asking for thanks. "Are you ready to file the complaint?" the driver asked, stepping out with a clipboard and a kind face. But Maggie didn't take it yet. She turned to the man, her former neighbor, once trusted, now unmasked, and asked him the one question that had haunted her ever since Duke led her off that porch and back into the world. "Why?" she asked. "Why me?" He didn't try to lie this time. He just lowered his eyes and said, "Because no one else was watching. You were kind, and kind people don't lock their doors." Maggie stood very still, letting the words settle. Not with shock anymore. Not with grief. Just with the ache of understanding, because she had always believed kindness was a light, but she had forgotten how often that light drew moths. She turned to the county official, took the clipboard, and signed her name with a hand steadier than it had been in months. Her name. Her name. Margaret Lawrence. The house would be restored. The land would be returned to its original intent. The deed would be honored. The sanctuary would open again. But none of that mattered more than what she had just proven, to herself, to the town, and to the memory she once feared was lost forever. She looked down at Duke, and the old shepherd wagged his tail once, slowly, like a curtain falling on a long play that had finally told the truth. They stood together for a moment longer before Maggie stepped off the porch and walked to the tree-lined road where 10 places still whispered her name, not because she was perfect, or famous, or untouched by pain, but because she had come back. And as the wind stirred the branches and the chapel bells rang faintly in the distance, Maggie turned to the woman beside her and asked, not in fear, but with quiet curiosity. "If I was strong enough to forget, do you think I'm strong enough now to forgive? Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.